15 British television legends spent decades as some of the most famous faces in the country, and every single one of them died with almost nothing left. One of them owned homes on 2 continents and dressed better than half of Hollywood. Decades later, a group of old friends had to organize a fundraiser just to keep him fed and warm. Nobody stole his money. There was no scandal, no single decision anyone could point to. It just disappeared, the same slow way it had arrived. That story is coming up at number 1. Stay with us. Today we're counting down all 15. Every one of them had millions of viewers who knew their face, their catchphrase, their timing, and felt like they knew them personally. And yet when the cameras stopped rolling for good, gambling, the taxman, illness, bad management, bad luck, or an industry with no safety net, took nearly everything they had built. A few of them made headlines when it happened. Most of them just faded, and the public never noticed at all. Let's start the countdown at number 15. Dick Emery. For years, Dick Emery could make an entire country laugh with a single line. His BBC sketch show ran for well over a decade, and the various characters he created, each with a catchphrase of their own, became some of the most imitated voices in British comedy, quoted in playgrounds and offices across the country every Monday morning. At his peak in the 1970s, he was one of the highest earners in British light entertainment, and audiences tuned in religiously just to hear him deliver those lines one more time. But behind the studio lights, Dick Emery's private life quietly drained his fortune. He married several times, and each divorce came with a costly settlement. He was also known for being extraordinarily generous, picking up bills for friends and colleagues without a second thought. None of it looked like recklessness at the time. It just added up. He never seemed short of money in public, always turning up immaculately dressed, always picking up the tab, always the life of the room. When he died in 1983, those close to him later admitted that his finances were in far worse shape than the public had ever imagined, with far less put aside than 4 decades at the top of British comedy should have allowed. He filled millions of homes with laughter every week and left behind a fortune far smaller than a career like his should have produced. A stark reminder that a big weekly paycheck and lasting wealth are not the same thing at all. Hughie Green. Opportunity knocks turned Hughie Green into one of the biggest names British television had ever produced, a talent show that pulled in audiences most modern broadcasters can only dream of, week after week, year after year, launching the careers of singers and comedians who went on to outshine him. He was instantly recognizable and extremely well paid, but away from the cameras, his life was far messier than viewers ever saw. He drank heavily. He sank money into business ventures that never came close to paying off. Late in his life, a personal scandal broke in the press that damaged both his reputation and his earning power almost overnight. At his peak, he was arguably more powerful than the stars he made, deciding who got their big break and who got sent home. By the time he died in 1997, the man who had discovered so many of Britain's biggest stars had faded almost completely from the industry he once dominated, with a fraction of the fortune his fame once suggested he had. His story shows how fast a huge career can vanish, even when millions of people once knew your name and tuned in week after week just to hear you speak. Before we continue, if stories like these are the kind of British television history you enjoy, hit subscribe now. It genuinely helps a small channel like this one keep making videos like this. Back to the countdown. Arthur Mullard. Born into poverty in Islington, Arthur Mullard left school at 14 and spent years boxing and drifting through bit parts before comedy finally made him a household name in the 1970s sitcom Romany Jones and its sequel. Millions of viewers knew his face and his gravelly Cockney voice, and he became one of the most instantly recognizable comic actors on British television. And yet, even at the very height of his fame, Arthur Mullard never moved out of the same modest council house in Islington where he had always lived. He never chased the mansion, the racehorses, or the flashy cars that so many of his contemporaries bought. Some who knew him said he simply never trusted the fame to last. Friends said he liked his local pubs, his neighbors, and the life he already knew, and saw no reason to trade it for something grander. When he died in 1995, his estate reflected exactly that instinct. A man who had made an entire country laugh, but who never allowed himself to believe the money would keep coming, and who was largely out of the public eye by the time he passed away, remembered by television schedulers far more than by the industry that had once booked him constantly. Reginald Bosanquet. News at 10 anchor. Reginald Bosanquet was, for over a decade, one of the most familiar voices in the country, becoming, alongside his co-presenter, one of the most talked-about newsreaders on British television. Millions trusted him to explain the day's events every single night. But behind that authoritative voice, Bosanquet battled alcoholism for most of his adult life, and it repeatedly made headlines of its own, damaging his reputation and eventually his career. He left ITN in 1979, and the high-profile broadcasting work that had once been guaranteed to him simply stopped arriving. Health problems, including a stroke, followed not long after. The tabloids that had once celebrated his charm turned that same charm into a running joke, and the invitations that once came automatically grew rarer and rarer. When he died from cancer in 1984, he had spent his final years largely away from the screens that had once made him a nightly guest in millions of homes, a newsreader the public had stopped seeing long before he actually passed away, his final broadcast years behind him rather than ahead. Harry H. Corbett. More than anything, Harry H. Corbett wanted to be taken seriously as a dramatic actor. Early in his career, sections of the British press even nicknamed him the English Marlon Brando. Then he took the role of Harold Steptoe in Steptoe and Son, and that ambition quietly became impossible. The show was a massive success, one of the most loved sitcoms the BBC ever produced, watched by tens of millions of viewers every single week. But it typecast him so completely that serious directors stopped calling, and the offers of proper dramatic work simply dried up. He spent the rest of his career fighting to be seen as anything other than a rag-and-bone man's son, taking pantomime bookings and guest spots just to keep working. Heart attacks in his final years slowed him further, and he suffered a serious car accident that left visible injuries on screen. Within days of leaving hospital after his first heart attack, he was back on stage in pantomime, because the mortgage did not care that his heart did. He died of a heart attack in 1982, at just 57, a talented dramatic actor who spent 2 decades trying to escape the very role that made him famous, and who never fully got the chance, remembered today almost entirely as a rag-and-bone man, rather than the serious actor he had once dreamed of becoming. Bella Emberg. Younger viewers may not know this name immediately, but anyone who grew up on British comedy in the 1980s remembers her instantly. Bella Emberg played the character simply known as Woman, alongside comedian Russ Abbott, on his hugely popular primetime sketch show. Millions watched every week, and she became a familiar, beloved face on British television. But being well-known and being financially secure turned out to be 2 very different things. Her work came in bursts. She would land a great role, and then months would pass with nothing at all. Producers loved her comic timing, but the steadier, better-paid work rarely came her way, a trap that caught so many character actors of her generation. In her later years, Bella Emberg spoke honestly and publicly about surviving mostly on basic state benefits, worrying about rent just like millions of ordinary people. She managed her difficulties quietly, without complaint, until she passed away in 2018. Fame, it turned out, never came with a pension attached, no matter how many millions of people knew her face and loved her work. Richard Beckinsale. In the mid-1970s, Richard Beckinsale was on track to become one of the defining stars of his generation. He played the lovable Lenny Godber in Porridge, one of the most beloved sitcoms in BBC history, while at the very same time playing the charming Alan in Rising Damp on ITV. Both shows were massive hits. He was just 29 years old, enormously talented, with everything ahead of him. It never got the chance to happen. Richard Beckinsale died suddenly in March 1979 from an undetected heart problem. He was only 31. His career simply had not had time to turn into real financial security. There had been no time to save, no time to buy property, no time for the kind of steady income that years of continued success usually brings. His death was so sudden that his young family, including his daughter, future actress Kate Beckinsale, who was only 5 at the time, were left in real financial difficulty. This was not a story of bad choices, gambling, or bad luck at the bookmakers, and there was no villain anywhere in it. It was, in the end, a story of time running out before success could ever turn into security, a career cut off right at the moment it should have started paying real, lasting dividends. Jack Hargreaves. An entire generation of British families knew Jack Hargreaves as one of the warmest, most trusted faces on television, even if younger audiences today might not immediately recognize the name. He presented Out of Town, a gentle, unhurried show about the British countryside, fishing and rural life that millions tuned into every week, the kind of life many viewers had left behind but still felt deeply connected to. And he also appeared regularly as a wise, pipe-smoking figure on children's television. Then, in 1981, the broadcaster he worked for lost its television license completely. It vanished almost overnight, and so did most of Jack Hargreaves' income. A presenter with his level of fame today would likely have long-term contracts and pension arrangements built up over decades. In the early 1980s, almost none of that protection existed for television performers. Hargreaves retired to the countryside he had spent years celebrating on screen, but without the financial comfort that his decades of work should have earned him. He died in 1994, aged 80, largely forgotten by the very industry that had once relied on him completely, in a countryside he loved, but could no longer afford to enjoy the way his decades of work should have allowed. If you have made it halfway through this list already, drop a comment with the name that has surprised you the most so far. It genuinely helps us know which stories to dig into next. Diana Dors. Britain's answer to Hollywood's biggest blonde stars. Diana Dors was a fixture on film sets and television screens alike. She worked constantly through the 1950s and beyond, and for a long stretch of time she was one of the most photographed women in the country, earning huge sums of money at her absolute peak. But Diana Dors also had a habit of investing in business ventures that failed one after another, and a series of very large tax bills pushed her finances into real trouble. At one point, tax authorities even moved to seize her property to cover what she owed. She kept working right up until the end of her life, not entirely by choice, but because she needed the income. She died from cancer in 1984, and those close to her later confirmed that money worries had shadowed her final years. A star who once symbolized British glamour, who once graced magazine covers across the entire country, spent her last chapter fighting to stay financially afloat instead of enjoying the rewards of a long, successful career. A reminder that a glamorous image and a healthy bank balance can drift very far apart. Sid James. 19. Carry On Films made Sid James one of the most recognizable comic actors in the entire country, famous for a distinctive, dirty laugh that audiences could pick out anywhere, on radio, in cinemas, or on their own television sets. But away from the cameras, Sid James had a serious and largely hidden gambling addiction. According to those who knew him, he lost tens of thousands of pounds over his lifetime betting on horses, and he arranged for a portion of his earnings to be set aside specifically for gambling before his own wife ever saw the money. He suffered his first heart attack in 1967, but kept working at a punishing pace regardless. On the 26th of April 1976, while performing on stage in Sunderland, he suffered a second and fatal heart attack in front of a live audience who, at first, simply thought it was part of the show. He was 62 years old, one of the most famous faces in British comedy, and a man whose habit at the betting shop had quietly consumed a fortune that his film career had spent decades building, one losing bet and one late-night wager at a time. Charlie Drake. South London poverty shaped Charlie Drake's earliest years. One of the youngest of several children in a family so poor, his mother pawned the bed linen every Monday just to get through the week, and he clawed his way up through working men's clubs to become one of the most popular slapstick comedians British television had ever seen, famous for his catchphrase and his willingness to do his own dangerous stunts on live television. At his peak, he was extremely well paid, and he spent it just as fast, buying a mansion, a string of racehorses, and expensive cars. He also loved to gamble. Then MRC sent him a tax bill so large that he later said he spent the next 3 years working purely to pay it off. He reinvented himself later in life as a respected dramatic actor, even winning acclaim for his performance in Harold Pinter's The Caretaker. But the financial damage from his years of excess never fully healed. He later said that period of paying off the taxman felt like working for nothing at all, years of effort simply vanishing into a debt he had built without ever meaning to. After a stroke ended his career, he spent his final years at Brinsworth House, a retirement home for entertainment professionals, and died there in 2006, a man who had once owned racehorses and a mansion, reliant, in the end, on the charity of his own industry to see out his last days in comfort. Freddie Starr. Sold-out tours and packed theatres made Freddie Starr one of the most talked-about entertainers on British television through the 1970s and 1980s, known for an unpredictable, high-energy act built on impressions and chaos that made him a genuine household name. Later in life, he became involved in a serious legal dispute over his reputation and chose to fight it in court, an understandable decision for anyone who believes they have been wronged. But legal battles in England are extremely expensive, and when he lost the case, he was left owing a legal bill of roughly £1 million. To cover it, he sold his home in Britain and moved into a modest apartment on the coast of southern Spain, living out his final years far from the country that had made him famous, largely on a basic state pension. He died there in May 2019. The distance between packed theatres, record-breaking television ratings, and that quiet apartment on the Spanish coast is one of the sharpest falls on this entire list, and it shows just how fast a single legal battle can undo an entire lifetime of earnings. Michael Elphick. What made Michael Elphick so watchable? A rare gift few actors have. He could be funny, warm, and completely believable all at the same time, which is far harder to pull off than it sounds. When he took the lead role in the ITV detective drama Boone in the late 1980s, audiences fell for him almost instantly, and the show regularly pulled in over 11 million viewers a week, a genuinely enormous portion of the entire British population choosing to watch him every single episode. He later joined EastEnders, the country's most watched soap opera, which pushed his fame even higher. But behind that professional success, Michael Elphick was fighting a severe, long-running battle with alcoholism, one that steadily damaged his ability to work, strained the professional relationships that keep a career alive, and silently ate away at the money his success had brought him. He died of a heart attack in September 2002, at just 55 years old. His story is not one of carelessness or bad decisions made on purpose. It is a story of illness, plain and simple, and of a man who never got the help he needed in time, despite being loved by millions of viewers for years on end. Tony Hancock. To understand Tony Hancock's story properly, you first need to understand how enormous his success actually was, because without that, what came next does not make sense. Hancock's Half Hour was not just a popular show. It was a genuine cultural event, and it changed what British radio and television comedy could achieve, working with two of the finest comedy writers this country has ever produced. By the end of the 1950s, Tony Hancock was, without much argument, the biggest comedy star in the country. Convinced the show's success was entirely his own doing, Hancock made the decision to part ways with the writers who had built it with him, one of the most damaging professional choices in British entertainment history. The quality of his work declined almost immediately. At the same time, he battled severe alcoholism that grew worse as his career struggled, his marriages fell apart, and his finances crumbled along with everything else. By 1968, Tony Hancock was in Sydney, Australia, filming a struggling television series, 44 years old, alone, and in financial trouble on the other side of the world. On the 25th of June 1968, he took his own life. From the very peak of British comedy to that lonely hotel room on the other side of the world in less than a decade, the scale of the fall is almost impossible to fully take in, and it remains one of the saddest stories in the whole history of British entertainment. If you are struggling with difficult feelings yourself, please know that support is available, and reaching out to someone you trust is always a strong thing to do, not a weak one. Terry Thomas. Here we are, number 1, the story we opened with. Terry Thomas, born Thomas Terry Hall Stevens in London in 1911, created one of the most perfectly crafted comic characters in British entertainment history. The gap in his teeth, the thin moustache, the beautifully tailored suits, and the magnificent, over-the-top indignation of the upper-class British troublemaker, self-important, hopelessly clumsy, easily outraged, and absolutely hilarious. He was far more than a domestic star. He crossed the Atlantic and appeared in major American films alongside some of the biggest names in Hollywood, including It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. At his peak through the late 1950s and 1960s, he earned huge amounts of money and lived a life to match it completely, with fine homes, fine clothes, and first-class travel around the world. Then, in the 1970s, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. As the illness progressed, his ability to work faded, and so did his income. His savings, never carefully managed for the long term, ran out completely, and the homes he had built piece by piece across 3 decades of international success were sold one by one. When journalists tracked him down in the late 1980s, Terry Thomas was living in a charity-funded flat in London with damp walls and almost no furniture, a man who had once been one of the most recognizable faces on 2 continents. The story shocked the entire British entertainment industry. People who had worked with him and admired him for decades came together in 1989 to organize a benefit concert specifically to raise money for his medical care and his living costs, and he died in January 1990. He is number 1 on this list not because his story is the most dramatic in isolation, but because of the sheer distance between what he once had and what he was eventually left with. International fame, Hollywood films, 3 decades of steady, successful work, a completely constructed, glamorous life, and at the very end of it, a damp flat and a benefit concert organized by the people who never stopped caring about him. 15 people, 15 careers, and 15 examples of how fame, no matter how big it looks from the outside, never guarantees anything beyond the moment it happens. Gambling took down Sid James and Charlie Drake. Taxes and failed business ventures took down Diana Dors. A legal battle finished Freddie Starr. Illness ended Michael Elphick and Terry Thomas. An industry that offered no long-term security left Jack Hargreaves and Reginald Bosanquet with almost nothing after decades of work. Typecast and boxed in Harry H. Corbett, alcohol and pride unraveled Tony Hancock, and Richard Beckinsale simply ran out of time before his success could turn into lasting security. 15 different causes, and in every single case, the same painful result. A name that millions once knew by heart, and a bank balance that told a completely different story by the end. If this kind of British television history is what you come here for, hit subscribe, share this with someone who remembers these names, and let us know in the comments which story stayed with you the most. We will see you in the next one.